There are places in Australia that no map can prepare you for. You can see them on satellite images, little clusters of structure against an ocean of red and brown, tiny interruptions in a landscape that goes on forever. But knowing they exist and actually understanding what they are, those are two completely different things. Queensland is the second largest state on this continent, bigger than most countries in the world. And somewhere in that vastness, in the heat and the distance and the silence, something happened. The rules bent, the logic shifted. Places grew here that couldn't have grown anywhere else. Not just because of the geography, but because of what the geography does to people over time. This isn't a travel guide. We're not looking at postcards. What we're looking at is what happens when isolation goes on long enough, deep enough, and hard enough that the places it creates stop resembling anything you'd recognize as normal. 15 places, one state, and by the time we get to number 1, you'll understand something about Queensland, and maybe about the world, that you didn't know before we started. Let's go. Picture the most remote pub in the world. Now put a racetrack next to it. Now throw 15,000 people at it for one weekend a year, then watch them all disappear, leaving behind almost nothing, as if the whole thing never happened. That's Birdsville. It sits right on the edge of the Simpson Desert, in the far southwest corner of Queensland, so close to the South Australian border that the sign feels almost like a joke. The permanent population is around 140 people. Some years it's less. The nearest town of any real size is Longreach, and that's still 6 hours away on a good day, on roads that aren't always roads. For most of the year, Birdsville is exactly what it looks like, a heat-blasted outpost at the end of the world, kept alive by the sheer stubbornness of the people who stayed. The Birdsville Hotel, the pub, has been standing since 1884. It's been rebuilt, extended, repaired, but it hasn't closed, not once. And then September comes. Every year, for the Birdsville races, something extraordinary happens. Planes start landing on the dirt strip. Caravans appear on the horizon. The population multiplies by 100 almost overnight. People drive days, to be there. They camp in the dust. They drink in the heat. They watch horses run on a track that gets used once a year and maintained with almost religious care. And then it's over. And everyone leaves. And Birdsville goes back to being 140 people against the desert. There's something almost defiant about that. Like the town knows exactly what it is and refuses to apologize for it. But Birdsville is just the warm-up. What comes next starts to get harder to explain. There's a train in Queensland called the Savannah Lander. It runs from Cairns into the Gulf country, deep into the dry savanna of the state's interior, on a narrow-gauge track that was originally built in the 1890s to service the goldfields. The gold ran out, the towns shrank, but the train kept running. The journey takes 4 days. 4 days on a train moving at roughly 40 kilometers an hour through some of the emptiest country on the continent. The landscape barely changes. The heat is constant. There are no cities at the end of it. Just Forsyth, a small town of a few hundred people sitting at the edge of the Innesley uplands, surrounded by ancient basalt plains and seasonal rivers. What makes this strange is not the train itself. It's the fact that people choose to take it. Not just grey nomads on a bucket list, though there are those too. Locals use it. Families use it. For some communities along the line, it's still the most reliable way in or out. The Savannah Lander runs because Queensland Rail decided, against what you'd think was logic, that connection matters more than efficiency. That a place being hard to reach doesn't mean it should be unreachable. Whether that was generosity or stubbornness probably depends on who you ask. Forsyth itself is quiet in the way that only very old, very small places can be quiet. Like it settled into itself a long time ago and stopped trying to be anything other than what it is. There's something peaceful about it, but also something that stays with you after you leave. A question you can't quite finish asking. You don't stumble across Mount Isa. You make a decision to go there. It sits in the northwest of Queensland, in the middle of a semi-arid landscape where the temperature regularly hits 45 degrees in summer, and the nearest city, Townsville, is almost 900 kilometers away. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most isolated cities of its size on Earth. And yet it has a population of around 20,000 people. Schools, hospitals, restaurants, nightclubs, a functioning urban infrastructure in the middle of nowhere. The reason is simple and brutal. Beneath that red ground is one of the richest mineral deposits on the planet: copper, lead, silver, zinc. The mine has been running since 1924, and it has never stopped. The smokestacks are visible from every part of town. They're not hidden or apologized for. They're just there, like weather. There's a particular kind of person that Mount Isa produces. Not tougher, exactly. That's too simple. More calibrated, maybe. People who have an accurate sense of what things cost. Time, distance, heat, effort. Nothing is wasted, because nothing is easy to replace. The town has a complicated relationship with its own existence. It knows it wouldn't be there without the mine. It also knows the mine won't last forever. There are people in Mount Isa who've been waiting for that conversation to start for 20 years. Others who refuse to have it. That tension lives in the streets alongside everything else. You can feel it if you're paying attention. Long before Queensland existed, something else was here. Winton sits in central West Queensland, in country so old it makes remote sound like an understatement. This is the place where Australia's most significant dinosaur fossils have been found, including the remains of animals that walked this ground over 100 million years ago. The Australian Age of Dinosaurs Museum is here. So is the Dinosaur Stampede, Lark Quarry, where the footprints of a prehistoric event are preserved in stone. Hundreds of small dinosaurs, running. You can stand there and look at those footprints and feel time compress in a way that's genuinely difficult to describe. But Winton is also where Banjo Paterson is said to have debuted Waltzing Matilda in 1895. The song that might be Australia's real national anthem, first performed in a small outback town that most Australians have never visited, in front of an audience who probably had no idea what they were hearing. The town today is small, a few thousand people, but it carries an enormous weight of things that happened here, in a place that the rest of the country barely thinks about. That's not unusual for Queensland. The further out you go, the heavier the history gets. And things happened in places nobody was watching, which means nobody was writing it down either. Winton holds its history the way the land holds those footprints, quietly, permanently, waiting for someone to stop and actually look. There's a weather phenomenon that occurs over the Gulf of Carpentaria, near a town called Burketown, that scientists still don't fully understand. It's called the morning glory, a rolling cloud formation that can stretch for 1,000 kilometers, moving low and fast across the sky, appearing in the pre-dawn hours like something the Earth is exhaling. Pilots fly from around the world to surf it. Gliders ride the wave it creates for hours without an engine. It is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary natural events on this planet. And it happens reliably in a place with a population of about 200 people. Burketown itself has a history that sits heavier than its size would suggest. It was one of the earliest European settlements in Queensland's Gulf region. It was devastated by floods and fever. A typhoid outbreak in 1866 killed a significant portion of the original settlement. The river floods regularly and severely. The town has been rebuilt more than once. The people who stayed did so because leaving felt wrong, or because there was nowhere else. Those reasons aren't always so different from each other. The morning glory comes every year, mostly between September and November. And every year a small group of people watch it roll in from the flat horizon, some of them having traveled thousands of kilometers to be there, some of them having never left. 200 people at the edge of a gulf under a sky that does things it shouldn't. In the 1890s, Croydon was one of the most important gold towns in Queensland. The streets were lined with hotels, banks, newspapers and businesses. People arrived from everywhere. There was money, noise, movement. Then the gold ran out. What remained is a town that looks, in certain lights, like a stage set that the production company forgot to dismantle. The buildings are still there, many of them. The wide streets remain. The layout of a prosperous colonial town is perfectly legible. You can walk the grid and see exactly where everything was. But the people are mostly gone. A few hundred remain, servicing the cattle properties that now dominate the surrounding land. What makes Croydon strange is not the emptiness, it's the clarity. The town was frozen at a particular moment and then left there. You can read what happened to it the way you can read a stopped clock. You know exactly when it stopped, and the fact of the stopping is the whole story. There's a heritage trail here, interpretive signs, a museum. Croydon knows it's a relic and has made a kind of peace with that. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is, a place that mattered enormously, briefly, and then watched the world move on without it. Some of the families there have been there for 5 generations, which means some people looked at all of this, the emptiness, the heat, the distance, and decided to stay anyway. That decision is never entirely easy to understand from the outside. There is a network of old stock routes running through Western Queensland that most Australians have never heard of. The Birdsville Track, the Diamantina, the Channel Country routes. These were the roads, if you can call them roads, along which millions of cattle were walked, on foot, by drovers, across hundreds of kilometers of some of the harshest land on Earth. Longreach sits at the center of this geography. It's the home of the Australian Stockman's Hall of Fame, which sounds like it might be kitsch and is actually one of the most serious cultural institutions in regional Australia. But the building isn't the point. The point is the landscape behind it. The Channel Country, the floodplains of the Diamantina and Cooper Creek, is a place that looks dead for most of the year, and then, when rain falls somewhere far to the north, fills suddenly with water and grass and life. The channels spread for hundreds of kilometers. Cattle are moved onto them at just the right moment, fattened on the grass that appears almost overnight, then walked out again before the country dries back to nothing. This process has been running for over 150 years. It is one of the great logistical operations in Australian agriculture. And it is almost entirely invisible to people in the cities. There's something that happens to you when you understand the scale of it. When you look at a map of those routes and try to imagine walking cattle along them, through the heat, the dust, the distance, you start to understand a different kind of country, one that operates on its own terms, in its own time. Cloncurry is a town that should probably be discussed more than it is. It holds the record for the highest temperature ever recorded in Australia, 53.1 degrees Celsius in 1889. 53 degrees. At that temperature, metal burns to the touch. The air is a physical thing you move through rather than breathe. It's also the birthplace of the Royal Flying Doctor Service. John Flynn established the first aerial medical service in the world here in 1928, because the distances between properties in the outback made conventional medicine essentially impossible. People were dying from things that would have been easily treated in a city, simply because the city was too far away. The Flying Doctor changed that. It changed everything, actually, not just for Queensland, but for remote Australia broadly. And it started here, in this town of a few thousand people, in the hottest recorded place on the continent. There's a particular irony in the fact that the most extreme environment produced one of the most compassionate institutions, as if the harshness demanded a response proportionate to itself. Cloncurry today is still hot, still remote, still serviced by the Flying Doctor. There are people alive in the outback right now because of a decision made in this town nearly 100 years ago. That weight doesn't disappear just because the buildings have changed. Camooweal sits almost exactly on the Northern Territory border. It has a few hundred permanent residents, a roadhouse, a pub, and access to one of the largest cave systems in Australia, the Camooweal Caves, which extend into a limestone karst system that drops away into darkness in the middle of flat, featureless plain. You're standing in land that looks like it goes on forever, and then the earth just opens. But what makes Comooweal specifically unusual is its border position. This is a place that has always existed in the space between two jurisdictions. The cattle that came through here, historically, were often moving between Queensland and the Territory. Different laws, different brands, different customs. The town developed as a kind of transitional zone, a place where you checked in before you disappeared into the next country. That energy still exists, not in any sinister way, just a particular quality of liminality, a sense that Comooweal is always between things, between states, between climates, between the visited world and the one that starts when the bitumen ends. There are roads out of Comooweal that are not sealed. They go into the Territory and keep going. People drive them in preparation, with spare tires and extra fuel, and the specific alertness of someone who knows they are beyond the point where casual mistakes get forgiven. The barramundi painted on the pub wall in Normanton is bigger than a car. It's a mural depicting a fish allegedly caught in the Norman River in 1959, reportedly the largest barramundi ever recorded, nearly 2 meters long. The fish is the town mascot. It is also, in some ways, the town's entire identity. Normanton sits in the Gulf country, on the lower Norman River, in a landscape that is simultaneously beautiful and deeply indifferent to human presence. The tides here are among the largest in Queensland. The wet season transforms the surrounding country into something barely navigable. The heat, the mud, the crocs. The environment here is not configured for convenience. But Normanton was a major port in the late 1800s. Ships came up the river. Goods moved through here to the mining towns inland. There was a railway, the Gulflander, which still runs, technically, though it now operates mostly as a tourist experience, connecting Normanton to Croydon through a country that has fewer people in it today than it did 100 years ago. That's a specific kind of decline. Not just abandonment, reversal. The infrastructure was built, operated, and then slowly lost its reason for existing. The Gulflander still runs its 150 kilometers of track to a town that is smaller than it was when the track was laid. There's something almost stoic about it, as if the train and the town both decided that simply continuing was its own kind of argument. This is where the tone changes. Palm Island is a place of extraordinary beauty. It sits off the coast between Townsville and Cairns, in the Coral Sea, tropical and green, and surrounded by water that shifts between blue and deep green depending on the sky. It is also one of the most troubled communities in Australia. Palm Island was established in 1918 as a reserve. The correct word is settlement, but what it functioned as was a controlled exile. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from across Queensland were removed to Palm Island, forcibly by government order, and placed under conditions of extreme restriction. They could not leave without permission. Their wages were controlled. Their children were vulnerable to removal. Entire communities were uprooted and deposited on an island from which they could not simply walk away. For decades, Palm Island was run as an institution. The people there were not considered to be living on their own land. They were considered to be accommodated on someone else's. That history didn't end cleanly. The conditions on Palm Island today are among the most difficult of any community in Queensland. High unemployment, significant health disadvantages, strained infrastructure, a relationship with Queensland authorities that has been shaped by generations of distrust built from real experience. In 2004, a man named Mulrunji Dumaji died in custody on Palm Island after an arrest. What followed, a riot, a colonial inquest, a series of legal proceedings that went on for years, became one of the most publicised events in the recent history of Australian Indigenous affairs. And for many people, it made visible something that had been structurally invisible, that Palm Island was carrying a weight that the rest of Australia had placed there and then looked away from. The island is still beautiful. The water is still that particular shade of impossible blue. And the community is still there, resilient in ways that are hard to articulate, which is perhaps what happens when you have no choice but to be. Daintree is one of the few towns in Australia where artesian bore water comes out of the ground at temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius. The Great Artesian Basin, one of the largest underground freshwater reservoirs in the world, sits beneath a significant portion of central and western Queensland. The water it holds fell as rain somewhere between 15,000 and 2 million years ago. It soaked into the earth in the ranges to the east and has been moving, incredibly slowly, through the porous rock beneath the continent ever since. When you put a bore down into the basin in Baduri, the water that comes up is ancient. Not metaphorically, literally ancient. That water hasn't seen the surface since before any European set foot on this continent. Baduri has a population of under 100 people. It is one of the most isolated local government centres in Australia. The roads in are long and, in the wet season, sometimes impassable. The landscape is the Channel country, flat, seasonal, vast. There's an outdoor thermal swimming pool fed by bore water. People drive hundreds of kilometres to sit in it. Think about what that means. A place so remote it barely registers on most maps. Water that fell from the sky before the Industrial Revolution, moving at a geological pace through stone, arriving here, warm and mineral-rich, to fill a pool in the desert. There is something genuinely strange about the relationship between time and place at the edges of Queensland, as if the land is running on a different clock to the rest of the world. Daintree is not a name most people know. That's partly the point. It sits south of Mount Isa, in the northwest of Queensland, in a landscape of cattle country and dry creek beds and red earth that goes further than you can hold in your mind at once. It's a small community, predominantly Aboriginal, that has existed in this country in various forms long before the name Daintree was attached to it. What makes Daintree historically significant is its relationship to the meatworks economy that once dominated northwest Queensland. For much of the 20th century, the cattle industry depended on indigenous labour, drovers, stockmen, station hands who worked the land and the cattle and the roots with extraordinary skill. That labour built the industry. For a long time they were paid in rations rather than wages. The Wave Hill Walk-Off of 1966, the strike by Gurindji workers in the Northern Territory that eventually led to land rights legislation, is the famous story. But that story had counterparts across Queensland that are less documented, less remembered, and every bit as real. Daintree holds some of that history in its silence. The town is small and not particularly well-resourced. The distance from services is significant. And there is a layer of history beneath the surface of the place that never quite became the public record it deserved to be. Some places carry their histories openly. Others carry them in a way that only becomes visible if you already know what you're looking for. There is a place on the northeast coast of Queensland where the modern history of Australia arguably begins. In June 1770, James Cook beached his damaged ship, the Endeavour, holed on the reef, in the mouth of a river, and spent 7 weeks here while his crew made repairs. During those weeks, there was sustained contact between the Endeavour's crew and the local Gugu Yimithir people. It was, by the standards of what followed, relatively peaceful. There were tensions, but there was also exchange, including the moment when one of Cook's sailors first heard the word that would enter English as kangaroo. The town that eventually grew here was named Cooktown. It became briefly one of the largest towns in Queensland during the Palmer River gold rush of the 1870s, when tens of thousands of people pushed through this port into the rainforest and the ranges in pursuit of gold. The Palmer River rush was brutal. There was significant violence against the local Wicmunken people and other First Nations groups as prospectors moved through their country. The history of Cooktown is simultaneously the history of first contact, of gold fever, of colonial violence, and of something that happened here that neither side could entirely control. Today, Cooktown has a few thousand people. It's a long drive from Cairns, and in the wet season, the road north of the Daintree is sometimes closed entirely. The town sits at the end of Queensland's sealed road network, beyond which the Cape York Peninsula begins. Cape York is its own story, but Cooktown is the door. Standing in Cooktown and understanding what happened here requires holding several things in your mind simultaneously: wonder and violence, beginning and rupture. The river is still there, The reef is still there. The landscape Cook looked at in 1770 is still largely recognizable. The question of what his arrival meant for the people who were already here is one that Australia is still, very slowly, working out how to answer. There are very few places in Australia where the distance between the country that most Australians imagine they live in and the country that actually exists becomes as visible as it does in Aurukan. Aurukan is a predominantly Aboriginal community on the western coast of Cape York Peninsula, on the shores of the Archer River estuary. To get there, you fly. The road to Aurukan, when it exists at all, is unsealed and seasonally impassable for months at a time. The community is, by institutional design, geographically isolated from everything that most Australians consider baseline access. The land around Aurukan is extraordinary. This is the western edge of Cape York. Salt pans, mangroves, wetlands, rivers that spread through the country in braided channels. The Wik and Wik-Mungkan people have lived in this country for tens of thousands of years. Their connection to this land is not historical in the sense of being past. It is present, active, and ongoing. The Wik case, the High Court decision of 1996, established that pastoral leases in Australia did not necessarily extinguish native title. It was one of the most significant legal decisions in Australian history. It changed the framework of land rights law. And the case bore the name of the people of this country, this community, this place, at the edge of the map. But Aurukan is also a community under intense pressure, chronic under-resourcing, distance from healthcare and education, complicated relationships with successive government interventions that have, over the decades, shifted the dynamics of community life in ways that are still reverberating. The gap between the significance of what the Wik people contributed to Australian legal history and the conditions of the community today is a kind of measurement of what Australia values and what it doesn't, of what it remembers and what it prefers not to. There's a particular silence that comes over you when you understand Aurukan properly. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of something that should be louder, a story that should be more widely known, a place that deserves more than the footnote it typically gets. Queensland is the place where the Australian idea of itself gets tested by its extremities, the heat, the distance, the isolation, the history. All of it presses on the idea until what's left is something more honest than what you started with. Aurukan is where that test is most visible. And maybe, if you've been paying attention across these 15 places, you already feel it. The sense that the edges of Queensland are not the margins of the country. They're closer to the center than most people are comfortable admitting. The red earth goes on. The heat doesn't lift. And somewhere out there, beyond the last sealed road, beyond the last mobile signal, beyond the reach of everything we assume is normal, Queensland continues. Just as it always has, on its own terms, in its own time.